Hello, my name is Lauren McArthur Harris, and I'm an Associate Professor of History Education at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies and the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. I was a Lincoln Center Fellow in 2016 and 2017 for a project called the Comparative Genocide Testimony Project with my colleagues Jason Bruner and Volker Benkart. And this project focused on the study of comparative genocide. Bruner and Benkart have a companion video called Genocide Ethics of Comparison that talks about the research implications of comparative study of genocide. And today I'm going to talk about the pedagogical implications of our project. So when we think about teaching genocide in schools is a growing topic. There's been Holocaust study in history and literature classes for decades. But recently, new standards have been written, new elective courses have been formed in states in the United States, and some states have new legislation mandating the teaching of the Holocaust and other genocides. But what we have found in looking across state standards in history, for example, is that standards do not always give a clear path for teachers in thinking about how they will represent genocide in their teaching, whether to teach genocides individually or comparatively. Often standards documents in history standards list genocides next to each other, despite being from different time periods or different regions, without alerting teachers how they might teach these. So I have an example here from the Arizona State Standards, which are currently under revision. But this example reads, students will examine genocides as manifestation of extreme nationalism in the 20th century, e.g., in parentheses, Armenia, Holocaust, Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo, and Sudan. So what we see here in this standard is one point of comparison that's given for teachers, which is extreme nationalism, but extreme nationalism isn't necessarily a cause of all of these genocides. And so teachers might struggle thinking about how to teach these, whether or not to use comparison or teach them individually in the context of the historical time period. So what we wanted to do with this part of our project was look at how teachers are teaching genocide in schools and how students are responding to it. And so our research questions for this project were, how do teachers guide students in comparing genocides? And then more generally, how do teachers approach the teaching of genocide? And to do this, we engaged in an exploratory case study of two teachers who we recruited, both taught a Holocaust literature elective course in high schools and were willing to work with us and teach some of our curriculum materials for a week-long unit on comparative genocide, focusing mainly on the Rwandan genocide and the Holocaust. We had developed curriculum materials in previous workshops we've been doing with teachers over the last couple of years. And we had articles that the teachers could choose from. We had survivor testimonies, transcripts, and accompanying videos. We had a reporting analysis form that students could use to analyze survivor testimonies, and a set of comparative themes that students could use for their analysis. And we asked the teachers to look at the materials and decide what they wanted to use, what they didn't want to use, and then we studied what they did. We interviewed the teachers, we observed them, we observed the students working, and we collected all of their student work. And so what we found was that the teachers did engage in comparison. We found three different kinds of comparison that they engaged in. So one is that they continually compared any genocide they were talking about to a definition of genocide, and I'll talk about these more in a couple minutes. They also focused on similarities and differences, but in different ways. And they also picked up on students' knowledge, greater knowledge of the Holocaust to compare to any other genocide that they were talking about. So I'll briefly discuss these in a little more detail. So So we found that both teachers decided to spend the first day of the unit discussing a definition of genocide. They each chose to use an article that discussed the United Nations definition of genocide, and they wanted to create, quote, a working definition that would take shape over the week, as Ms. Brown, one of the teachers, told us. And by the way, all the names I'm going to say are pseudonyms that the teachers chose for themselves. And so by taking that much class time to discuss the definition, they then set the stage for later in the unit where they would continually go back to that definition. And any genocide that they discussed, they would compare back to their class working definition that they had developed. So for example, the other teacher, Ms. Smith, asked students at a later point in the unit if current events in Syria would meet the definition of genocide that they had discussed. So we found that comparison, definitional comparison, was a big part of both of the teachers' units. And then, of course, not surprisingly, the teachers focused on similarities and differences between genocides. But the teachers were much more comfortable focusing on similarities between genocides and were hesitant to discuss differences. And this relates to our larger work about the ethical considerations in thinking about comparing genocides, and the work that Brunner and Benkart discussed on trying to avoid hierarchies of suffering when comparing different genocides to each other. So both teachers tapped into this in their comments and how they approached the genocide discussion in classes. But there's also, scholars have said, there's also danger in focusing too much on similarities between genocides, that it could lead to overgeneralizations. And that is why we, in our project, have really focused on survivor testimonies as places where comparison can take place, looking at individual stories. And I just wanted to show you two quotes from the teachers that bring up some of these issues. So Ms. Smith, in talking about comparison, said, "I don't like to compare them straight across. There are definitely similarities. That's what I show the students." And Ms. Brown said, before she started teaching for the week, "I think the tact I'm going to take this week is that we're not saying this one was worse than this one, or wow, look at what they went through versus what they went through. It's let's just look at what started it. What are some of the similarities? What are some of the differences?" So despite the fact that the teachers spent more time during the unit on similarities, they did both choose to use a graphic organizer on the last day of the unit that we had provided that had the students compare similarities and differences between two survivor testimonies, one from the Rwandan genocide and one from the Holocaust. And as you can see here from this image of student work, the center circle is where the students noted similarities between the two testimonies. And this student tapped into the comparative themes that were also provided. The outer circle shows places where the stories were different, where the individual stories were different. And the larger squares show differences between the historical contexts of the two genocides. So this sort of brought the comparison together at the end of the unit in both teachers' classes. The other type of comparison that we saw teachers using was picking up on students' prior knowledge of the Holocaust as a point of comparison for every other genocide. Students definitely had more knowledge of the Holocaust going into this unit because of the course they were engaged in, but also because of other prior courses where the Holocaust was the only genocide that they had discussed. So we were surprised to learn that students had little to no knowledge of the Rwandan genocide before this unit. So I have a couple of quotes here from students talking about the Rwandan genocide. One student said, "It's sad that I never heard about it until now." Another said, "It's sad that we go through history only for it to happen again." And a third student said, "We can't just think that the Holocaust is the only genocide that happened." So by using the Holocaust as a point of comparison, the teachers were trying to extend students' knowledge beyond the Holocaust as the only genocide that they were aware of. Thinking about how these teachers approach teaching genocide more broadly, With both teachers, they strove to create a safe place in which students could learn about these really difficult histories. They acknowledged the emotional challenges of studying this kind of history, not only for themselves, but for their students. And they also advocated for students to get involved with fighting genocide outside of the classroom. And one of the teachers actually gave them suggestions and tools for how they might do this outside of the classroom. In thinking about how they approach genocide in their classrooms, I wanted to read to you a quote from Ms. Smith, who said, "They are really affected by what they learn. It's that idea of bringing them safely in and taking them safely out every day. That's a challenge sometimes. You're working against a bell all the time, trying to time it where you still have a few minutes of discussion to wrap things up and then get them back in a good place before they leave. Again, making sure that they understand the seriousness of the topic and respect that." So this working against the bell was something that we noticed that is definitely a consideration when we think about how teachers should approach teaching genocide in schools. They have to make sure their students aren't leaving in an emotional state that is can be disruptive to them, that they have time to take them safely out, as Ms. Smith said. But we also noticed some other realities of the high school classroom that sometimes seemed like a jarring juxtaposition with teaching genocide. So for example, the teachers tried to seek a balance between having an engaging classroom that is part of a larger high school and these very challenging, difficult topics. So Ms. Smith says, "I set that tone on the first day of class, that this is a really serious topic. We're going to take it seriously, but that doesn't mean that we never have fun in the class. Yeah, we had Spirit Week, and kids were dressed up on certain days. Prom was right around the corner. We still had to address those issues." So in our observations, we noticed the teachers having to seek a balance between the realities of being in a high school, being in a 50-minute class, and these difficult topics for students to engage in. So to conclude, we were very heartened to see these teachers engaging in the comparative study of genocide and having their students engage in analysis of survivor testimonies. Scholars have noted that this type of comparison can help students engage in ethical questions around mass atrocities and around human nature. And we also were interested in the fact that the teachers both encourage their students, as Ms. Brown said, to become architects of change, to take this topic outside of the classrooms and into the world. Thank you.